Close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine that the world outside your window has grown very, very quiet. The hum of the modern day, every notification, every obligation, every restless thought has begun to soften the way a candle softens when you cup your hand gently around its flame. The light does not go out, it simply dims, and in that dimming something older moves in to take its place. There is a city, and within that city, behind walls of pale limestone that have absorbed 500 years of morning sun, there exists a world that most human eyes were never permitted to see. A world of rosewater fountains and the distant honey-slow call of a muezzin drifting over terracotta rooftops. A world of rustling silk, of the low laughter of women in shaded courtyards, of slippered footsteps on cool marble floors worn smooth by generations of unhurried walking. This is Istanbul, and tonight the gates of the Topkapi Palace open not with the grinding of iron, but with a whisper, and we are invited inside. You are perfectly safe. You're warm. Your body is growing heavier and more comfortable with every word you receive. There is nowhere you need to be tonight, nothing you need to remember, nothing left undone that cannot wait until morning. We are simply going to drift gently and together back through 5 centuries of candlelight and history into the remarkable, tender, forgotten lives of the women who called the Ottoman Harem their home. Breathe in. The journey begins now. Before we pass through the first inner gate, and there are many gates, each one more ornate and more ancient than the last, let us pause here for just a breath. This quiet vestibule between the modern world and the one we are about to enter together. The stones beneath our feet are cool. The air carries the faint green scent of cypress trees that have stood in this garden since before your great-great-grandmother drew her first breath. Somewhere deeper inside the palace walls, you can almost hear the sound of water, a fountain perhaps, or a marble basin being gently filled. And the sound is so patient, so unhurried, that your shoulders have already begun to release their weight. If you have found yourself here in this particular corner of history, then you are someone who understands that the most restful kind of sleep is the kind that arrives wrapped in wonder, the kind that comes when your mind is not emptied, but rather filled with something beautiful and distant and softly lit. There are many more nights like this one waiting for you. Many more worlds behind many more gates. Ancient Egypt, the candlelit courts of Versailles, the silk roads of the Tang dynasty, all of them patient, all of them warm, all of them ready to receive you. If you press the subscribe button now, gently, no urgency, no rush, you will never have to search for this feeling again. It will simply be there, waiting, the way a good bed always is. Now, shall we go inside? The gate is open. The torches are lit. Follow me. The first thing you notice, before you have even fully crossed the threshold, Protestantis the wall. Not the grandeur of it, though it is grand, rising some 12 meters above the ground. Its pale limestone surface the colour of old cream and dry honey baked together under 1,000 summers of Anatolian sun. No, it is not the grandeur that catches your breath. It is the texture, because up close in the low amber light of a late evening, the surface of this wall is not smooth at all. It is layered, alive, almost. Centuries of repair and addition and quiet reinforcement have left their marks in long horizontal seams, in patches where a slightly different shade of stone was fitted against an older section, in places where the mortar between the blocks has been worn away to reveal a dark, cool gap no wider than a fingernail. If you pressed your palm flat against this wall, and please in your imagination tonight do exactly that, you would feel that it is slightly warm on its outer face, still holding the heat of a day that ended perhaps 2 or 3 hours ago. But as you move your hand upward toward the shadowed sections near the crenellations, the warmth fades into something cooler and more ancient, something that belongs not to today but to the accumulated patience of a structure that has been standing in this same position since the middle of the 15th century. The harem of Topkapi Palace was not built all at once. This is one of the most important things to understand about it, and one of the most beautiful things too. It grew over 3 centuries under the tenure of 30 different sultans. New chambers were added onto existing ones, new corridors were cut through older walls, stairways were inserted where there had previously been only blank stone, windows were opened and then closed again and then reopened in different positions, as if the building itself could not quite make up its mind about how much light it wished to admit. The result of all this organic, unhurried accumulation is a structure that moves through space in the way that a river moves, not in a straight line, not according to any single plan, but according to the pressure of time and necessity and the quiet desires of the people who lived within it. There are in total more than 400 rooms. 400! And yet to call them rooms is perhaps to give the wrong impression, because the English word carries with it a certain regularity, a certain box-like finality that does not belong here. Many of these spaces are better understood as chambers or alcoves or passageways that widened into something just large enough to contain a divan and a lamp and a woman sitting with her embroidery in the last light of a winter afternoon. Some of them connect to other rooms through doorways so low that you must bow your head to pass through, a feature that is either an architectural accident or a deliberate design meant to encourage a kind of humility in the act of entry, a bowing of the self before the space. Others open onto small internal courtyards, no larger than a generous bedchamber, where a single fig tree grows from a square of soil surrounded on all 4 sides by plastered walls hung with blue and white Iznik tiles that catch the light in the way that still water catches the light, holding it, turning it, releasing it again slowly. Let us walk a little deeper now. The corridor we have entered is narrow, perhaps 2 arms' width across, and its ceiling is vaulted in the Ottoman style, a series of shallow arches that run the length of the passage like the spine of some enormous creature seen from the inside. The floor beneath your feet is marble, not the cold clinical marble of modern buildings, but something altogether warmer and more worn, a pale grey stone veined with the faintest traces of amber and rose, smoothed by the passage of slippered feet across so many decades that in certain stretches, near the doorways and at the turns, you can see the stone has been worn into a very gentle depression, a hollow no deeper than the thickness of a coin, but undeniably there, undeniably human, physical record The walls of this corridor are plastered in a warm off-white, and at intervals set into carved niches there are oil lamps, small bronze-bodied, with wicks that burn low and steady, and cast a pool of light roughly the size and shape of a dinner plate onto the wall and floor around them. Between the lamps, the corridor falls into a shadow that is not quite darkness. It is the colour of very old amber, the colour of a room seen through half-closed eyes, and it carries a smell that is difficult to name precisely, but that contains within it many smaller smells layered together. The faint mineral coolness of the stone itself, the dry sweetness of beeswax from the lamps, the ghost of rosewater that was perhaps sprinkled on the floor tiles in a corridor nearby, and underneath all of these something older and more indefinite, the compressed exhalation of centuries, the slow breathing out of a building that has held human life within it for longer than most nations have existed. At the far end of this corridor a door stands slightly ajar. It is made of dark wood, walnut most likely, or possibly a particularly dense and resonant variety of chestnut, and its surface is carved in geometric patterns of extraordinary delicacy. Interlocking stars and hexagons and eight-pointed forms that repeat and nest inside one another with a mathematical precision that is also somehow deeply organic, the way a honeycomb is precise and organic simultaneously. The brass fittings on this door, its hinges, its handle, the small decorative bosses set at regular intervals along its frame, have been polished so many times that their original sharp edges have been softened into curves. Then they glow in the lamplight with the particular warmth of old metal that has been touched 10,000 times by 10,000 different hands. The door is open just wide enough to see a slice of the room beyond. There is light inside, warmer than the corridor, light more golden, more generous. There is the sound, very faint, almost more felt than heard, of water moving somewhere not far away. And there is, drifting through the crack in the door, as if it has been waiting specifically for this moment to drift, the scent of something floral and slightly sweet, something that resolves, if you breathe it in slowly and without hurry, into the unmistakable, ancient, wholly beautiful scent of attar of roses. We are not ready to enter that room quite yet, but we are almost there. Close your eyes just a little more. Feel the marble beneath your feet. Hear the distant water. Let the smell of roses come to you at its own pace, its own time, the way all truly beautiful things must be allowed to come. We have stepped into history now. And history. Tonight. Protestantis warm. Every story that unfolded within these walls began, some sense, with a journey. Journey that was long and often bewildering, and that carried within it the particular quality of irreversibility, the deep understanding settling slowly into the bones over days and weeks of travel, that the world one had known before was not going to be there when one looked back over one's shoulder. The mountains of the Caucasus fading into distance, the shores of Circassia growing small and then invisible behind the grey-green waters of the Black Sea, the cities of Georgia and the steppes of Ukraine becoming memories that over time would take on the soft, uncertain quality of dreams, present, precious, but impossible to quite hold steady in the mind. The women who came to the Ottoman Harem arrived through many different channels, and it is important to understand, as we settle into this quiet evening together, that the institution itself was vastly more complex and more human than the caricatures that later centuries would impose upon it. The word harem comes from the Arabic haram, meaning sacred or forbidden, not in the sense of something dangerous, but in the sense of something protected, something set apart from the ordinary world and afforded a particular kind of reverence. The harem of Topkapi was, in its truest form, the imperial household, the domestic and private world of the Sultan, governed by its own hierarchies, its own rules, its own economy and culture and system of education. The women who entered it were known, in the early stages of their tenure, as cariala, a word that translates most closely as female servants or concubines, though neither English word quite captures the full range of what this meant in practice. They arrived primarily as gifts or through the devshirme-adjacent systems of the empire. Young women, often between the ages of 12 and 16, sent from the provinces or the outer territories or presented by intermediaries who understood the protocols of such transactions. Many came from the Caucasus region, which was so consistently represented within the harem's population that Circassian and Georgian ancestry became, over the centuries, deeply woven into the fabric of the Ottoman imperial family itself. Others came from the Balkans, from Hungary, from the coastal regions of the Black Sea, from communities as far-flung as Venice and Abyssinia. They did not arrive, as a general rule, already knowing what they were arriving into. Imagine, for a moment, the first morning. The ship has docked. The city of Istanbul rises before you in the early light, not as it appears in the maps and paintings you may have seen, but as it would have appeared to a young woman approaching it for the first time from the water, with no frame of reference adequate to its scale. The minarets of Hagia Sophia and the blue mosque standing against a sky the colour of pale turquoise silk, their pencil-thin towers impossibly delicate for structures of such height, the dome of the great mosque swelling upward from its base like a vast stone breath held forever, the waterfront alive with the activity of the Golden Horn, the creak and slap of boats, the calls of merchants, the smell of fish and salt, and the particular dry warmth of sun-baked wood. It was by any measure one of the most remarkable cities in the world, and yet this young woman standing at the rail of a ship, perhaps pressing her fingers into the wood to feel something solid and real beneath them. For her, the sight of it may have produced something closer to vertigo than wonder, at least in that first unguarded moment. She would have been received at the palace not with ceremony but with practicality. There was a thoroughness to the intake process that was, depending on how one reads it, either reassuring or overwhelming. She would have been bathed, her clothing changed, her physical condition assessed. She would have been evaluated for her skills. Could she read? Did she sing? Was she quick with numbers, or patient with needlework, or possessed of that particular quality of presence and intelligence that the palace officials were trained to recognize as potential? Based on this assessment, she would begin to find her place within the elaborate social architecture of the harem. At the base of this architecture were the asemi, the novices, the newcomers, those who had most recently arrived and who were still in the process of learning. The language, first of all Ottoman Turkish, formal and elaborate, and nothing like the spoken dialects of their homelands, a language that would need to be absorbed over months of careful listening and practice, beginning with the basic protocols of address and deference, and expanding slowly into something richer and more nuanced. The customs, second, how to move through a room without disturbing its atmosphere, how to serve a meal without sound, how to address a superior, and how to manage those below you with a combination of authority and gentleness. The religion, third, Islam, which many of these young women had not been raised within, and which they were expected to embrace and internalize not as a forced conversion but as a genuine adoption, a becoming. The room in which the novices slept was long and low-ceilinged, lined on both sides with narrow beds separated from one another by curtains of undyed cotton. The beds were simple: a wooden frame, a straw-filled mattress covered in coarse linen, a single blanket of woven wool in winter, a thin cotton sheet in summer. But the room was never cold in the ways that mattered. There were voices in it always, or at least until the lamps were extinguished and the enforced quiet of night descended. There was the sound of whispered conversation in half a dozen languages, questions asked and partially answered, homesickness acknowledged in the darkness with the particular honesty that darkness permits. There was on some nights the sound of one woman crying, quietly, carefully, the way people cry when they do not want to be heard and are not quite sure they are succeeding, and on those nights, more often than not, someone else would reach across the narrow gap between two beds and take a hand in the darkness and hold it and say nothing at all, because there was nothing that could be said and the holding was sufficient. Friendships formed in those rooms that would last for the rest of these women's lives. In the weeks and months that followed, the structure of the days would begin to establish itself, a rhythm as dependable as the call to prayer that marked its intervals, a rhythm that would become over time not a constraint but a comfort, the comfort of knowing what comes next, the comfort of inhabiting a day whose shape you recognized. But that rhythm belongs to a later morning. Tonight, we simply rest in the knowledge of arrival. in the knowledge that these women came from the wide and various world, and that they found each other in the lamplight of a long room, and that what grew between them in the days and years that followed was, be any honest account, kind of life. Full, complicated, real. And worth remembering. There is a particular quality of light inside the harem that no description can fully render, but that every attempt to describe brings one incrementally closer to understanding. It is a light that has been filtered, processed, in a sense, by the time it reaches you passed through the geometry of a latticed window screen, then through the gauze curtain hanging behind it, then through the still air of a room that has not been opened to the outside world in perhaps several hours, absorbing on its way the warmth of walls that have been holding heat since noon, the coolness of marble floors that have been absorbing the relative coolness of shadowed stone since early morning. By the time this light falls on your hand or on the book open in your lap or on the surface of the small wooden table beside you, it has become something altogether different from the hard, direct, declarative light of the outside world. It has become a proposal rather than a statement, suggestion of illumination rather than illumination itself. The rooms of the harem were designed, consciously or otherwise, to work with this quality of light. The windows were set high in the walls, not at eye level as we have come to expect, but above the head, positioned so that the light entered from above at an angle and fell downward through the room in long, diagonal columns that shifted and contracted as the sun moved through its arc outside. In the mornings, these light columns fell steeply through the eastern windows, lying long and pale across the tiled floors, picking out the blues and greens and ochres of the Iznik patterns with a clarity that the afternoon light would soften. By midday, the columns shortened and brightened, and the room was at its most luminous, not brightly lit in any modern sense, but alive with an even, distributed warmth that made every surface in the room, the carved plasterwork of the walls, the surface of the divan cushions, the gilded calligraphy above the doorways, legible in its full detail. By late afternoon, as the sun moved west and the light through the remaining uncurtained windows became horizontal and amber, the room underwent a transformation. Shadows deepened in the corners, the tiled walls lost their precision and became instead fields of gentle, shifting colour. The carved woodwork of the ceilings, those extraordinary suspended geometries of interlocking polygons and star forms that in daylight appeared primarily as an exercise in mathematical virtuosity, became, in the late afternoon amber, something more like a forest seen from below. Canopy of forms whose individual logic dissolved into a collective impression of organic complexity. The ceilings deserve particular attention. In the principal rooms of the harem, the salon of the Valide Sultan, the imperial hall, the rooms of the favourite women, the ceilings were works of extraordinary craft. The base was generally a shallow dome or a coffered flat ceiling in wood, and into this base craftsmen had fitted a puzzle of wooden pieces so precisely joined that the seams between them were, in many places, invisible to the naked eye. The surface of these ceilings was painted not with pictorial images, which were generally discouraged by Islamic decorative tradition, but with patterns, endlessly inventive, endlessly various, yet always organized according to underlying geometric principles that gave them coherence, even as they proliferated in complexity. Spiraling arabesques of intertwined leaves and blossoms rendered in the warm reds and deep greens and lapis blues of natural pigments, fields of small repeated forms, rosettes, palmettes, angular knotwork, that tiled the surface of the ceiling the way a mosaic tiles a floor, each individual unit simple, the whole that they composed together extraordinary. Between the ceiling and the walls in many rooms ran a band of calligraphic inscription, passages from the Quran rendered in the flowing Thuluth script by calligraphers whose training had consumed decades of their lives. These inscriptions were not merely decorative, they were functional in the deepest sense. They oriented the room within a larger cosmological framework. They reminded the women who lived beneath them that the space they inhabited was understood to exist within a divine order, and they provided for those who could read them, which was by no means all of the harem's residents, but was a significant and growing portion as the institution's educational provisions expanded, a continuous ambient text that changed its meaning depending on which passage you happened to let your eye rest upon on any particular morning. The walls below the calligraphic band were tiled in the finest rooms, with Iznik ceramic panels of breathtaking quality. Iznik, the city roughly 100 kilometers southeast of Istanbul, formerly known as Nicaea, where the ceramic tradition had been refined over generations into perhaps the highest achievement of its kind in the world, produced tiles whose white ground was so dense and so brilliantly opaque that it appeared almost to generate its own light from within, and whose painted decoration in cobalt blue, turquoise, sage green, and the characteristic Iznik tomato red achieved a vibrancy that no description quite does justice to, because it is fundamentally a matter of material rather than colour, the particular way that light moves through and reflects from the tin-glazed surface, the particular way the colours interact with each other across the width of a wall. In the harem's finest tilework, the designs moved across multiple panels as if the wall were a single continuous surface. Flowering branches of cherry and hyacinth and carnation unfolding from panel to panel, their stems bending and their blossoms opening according to a pattern that the craftsman had planned before the tiles were fired, and that would only become fully legible when all the panels were installed together in the correct sequence. Below the tile panels, the lower walls were generally panelled in wood, walnut or chestnut or occasionally fruitwoods, fitted into frames and carved with the same geometric precision as the window screens and the ceiling coffering. Set into the lower walls at intervals were the niches, small arched recesses, perhaps half a metre deep and slightly more than a metre wide, fitted with a low shelf of smooth stone and a back wall of tile. These niches served many purposes. They held oil lamps or small bronze braziers in winter, or arrangements of flowers in summer, or simply the objects that a woman wished to keep near her, a small Koran in its embroidered cover, a glass bottle of perfume, a folded letter, comb of carved tortoiseshell resting on a square of velvet. Each niche was in a sense a miniature room within the room, a space of a scale that related to the human hand and the human face, rather than to the sweep of architecture around it. And it was in these niches, in these small intimate spaces set into the larger geometry of the room, that you found perhaps the most truthful record of the lives that were lived here, not in the grand proclamations of the inscriptions or the imperial ambition of the tilework, but in these small private alcoves that held the things a woman loved enough to keep close. The rooms breathe still. If you listen. In every carved surface, every worn marble threshold, in every niche where a lamp once burned, there is a breath being held, life being remembered, afternoon being preserved in amber and tile and the particular quality of filtered, ancient light. At the heart of the harem, embedded within it like a warm coal placed at the centre of a great sleeping body, there was the hammam, the bathhouse. To enter the hammam of Topkapi Palace is to pass through a doorway that functions in many ways as a threshold between two different registers of human existence. The world outside, even the already softened, already hushed world of the harem's corridors and chambers, operates according to a certain tension, a certain held awareness. The ordinary background stress of being a person in a social world, managing one's presentation and one's position, and the thousand small calculations that social life requires. The world inside the hammam releases all of that. It does not demand the release, it simply makes holding on impossible. The heat makes it impossible, the steam makes it impossible. The sound of water moving over stone, continuous and unhurried and entirely indifferent to rank or worry, makes it impossible. The hammam of the harem was divided, as all Ottoman bathhouses were, into three successive chambers of increasing warmth. You entered first through the soğukluk, the cool room, a high-ceilinged antechamber where the temperature was merely pleasant, the air merely soft, where you left your outer garments folded on the carved wooden bench and accepted the large cotton bath wrap the pishtamal offered by one of the attendants, who moved through this room with the practised unhurried efficiency of women who had performed these gestures 10,000 times. The soğukluk was lined in the same Iznik tile as the rest of the finest harem rooms, and its floor was a checkerboard of dark and pale marble, and it smelled of clean cotton and faintly of the cedar from the shelving that lined one wall. From the sohukluk, you moved into the ulikluk, the warm room, and here the first tendrils of steam reached you, and the first awareness of the heat as a physical presence arrived in your chest and shoulders, loosening something there that you had not known was tight. The walls of the iliklik were pale marble from floor to ceiling, and the light entered through small glazed apertures set into the dome overhead, round glass inserts, each no larger than the palm of a hand, through which the light fell in narrow columns that the steam turned solid and visible, so that the air of the iliklik appeared to be threaded with pale, softly luminous pillars moving slightly as the steam moved, giving the room the quality of a space that was gently, perpetually breathing. And then the hararet, the hot room proper. This was the innermost chamber, the heart within the heart, and entering it was an experience that required a moment of deliberate surrender, because the heat here was absolute and immediate, and the first breath of it expanded in your chest, like something very ancient recognizing itself in you. The hararet was domed, its ceiling rising to a height of perhaps 6 or 7 meters above the central platform, the Göbek Taşı, the navel stone, a great raised slab of marble occupying the center of the floor like an altar, heated from below by the furnace system that lay beneath the building, so warm to the touch that to lay your full length upon it was to feel, very precisely and very completely, the warmth moving upward through your entire body from your heels to your shoulder blades to the back of your skull. The steam in the hararet was dense enough to blur the far wall into a soft suggestion of itself, and the sound of water was everywhere, falling from the marble basins set into the niched walls around the perimeter, trickling through the channels cut into the floor, pooling in the central drainage that kept the hot room from flooding while producing, continuously and without variation, that particular sound of moving water that is among the most reliably restful sounds in the accumulated experience of the human species. For the women of the harem, the hammam was not merely a place of physical cleanliness. This is the crucial thing to understand about it. The hammam visits were social events of the highest order, occasions that combined in a single compressed and steam-softened experience the functions of a bath, a social salon, a news exchange, a negotiation space, a place of celebration, and a place of grief. A woman of the harem might spend 3 to 5 hours in the hammam on a full bathing day. Babies were introduced to the hammam's rituals as young as a few weeks old. A woman's first visit to the hammam after giving birth was marked as a celebration. Her attendants would arrive with gifts and sweets. Betrothals within the extended palace community were sometimes negotiated in the relaxed and levelled atmosphere of the hot room, where the ordinary markers of rank, clothing, jewellery, the formal protocols of address were temporarily suspended, and what remained was simply the fact of being human and warm and honest. The harem hammam had its own designated attendants, Telek women whose entire professional role was the care of other women's bodies during the bathing process. These women were trained in the specific art of the kise, the exfoliation technique performed with a rough goat hair mitt that applied in long, firm strokes along the grain of the skin, removed the accumulated dead layers and left the skin beneath with a smoothness and a warmth that the women who experienced it described in terms that veered consistently toward the spiritual rather than the merely physical. After the kise came the soap, not our modern processed bar soap, but a dense olive oil-based product produced in enormous rounds and cut to use, deeply moisturizing, with a faint green color and a smell that was clean and herbal and faintly medicinal in the most reassuring sense. The lather from this soap was worked into the hair and across the body with a methodical thoroughness that left, when it was finally rinsed away with cascades of warm water poured from copper bowls, the particular sensation of having been returned to some fundamental, clean, unhurried version of yourself. After the bathing was complete, the women returned through the chambers in reverse, moving from the hararet through the warm room and then into the cool room again, their bodies wrapped now in fresh cotton, their hair wound in a separate wrap, their feet in the high wooden platform sandals, the takunia, that elevated them above the wet floor with a quiet, percussive knock at each step that echoed pleasantly in the tiled rooms. In the sogukluk, They would recline on the benches while their hair was combed and their skin was anointed with oils, rose oil, almond oil, blend of sandalwood and amber in cooler months, and tea or sherbet was brought, and conversations that had begun in the steam continued in the pleasantly cooled down aftermath, voices slower now, bodies heavier in the particular and deeply satisfying way that warmth makes the body heavy. The hammam visits could happen several times a week for the principal women of the harem. For others, particularly the novices, they were less frequent and more supervised. But every woman within those walls knew the hammam's rhythms, had memorized the particular marble patterns of its floor and the sound of its water and the weight of its heat, and carried that knowledge within her for the rest of her life. No matter where the years eventually took her, the warmth of the Göbek Taşı remained in the body's memory. Stone remembers warmth, and so do we. There was sky above the harem. This seems, stated plainly, like a simple and obvious fact. Of course there was sky. There is sky above everything. But within the enclosed and interior world of the imperial household, where the primary relationship with the outside was mediated through latticed screens and high windows and the filtered geometry of architectural apertures, the sky above the harem's gardens was something qualitatively different from the ordinary background sky of the everyday world. It was something earned, something that arrived as a gift at the end of a corridor, visible suddenly and completely when a garden door swung open, the full blue expanse of it appearing with the quality of a revelation. The harem's gardens were multiple, and they varied considerably in scale and character. The largest of them, the main terrace garden that occupied a substantial area along the seaward side of the palace complex, was of a scale sufficient to move through without feeling the enclosing press of walls, though the walls were there regardless, running around the perimeter at a height that maintained the privacy that was the garden's fundamental precondition. Within those walls, however, and under that sky, a space had been created over the centuries that was, by any measure, extraordinary. The garden's design followed the formal Persian-influenced principles that governed Ottoman landscape architecture throughout the imperial period. A geometry of paths and plantings organized around central axes, with water as both practical element and symbolic focal point. The main fountain at the garden's heart was not a large theatrical structure, but rather a quiet, low basin of pale marble, its rim perhaps 30 centimeters above the paving, its interior lined with tiles in the deepest cobalt blue that Iznik could produce, so that the water in the basin appeared not colourless but faintly, beautifully blue or green depending on the angle of the light, shifting between those two colours the way shallow tropical water shifts, the tiles beneath giving colour to transparency. The sound of this fountain, and this is worth lingering over, because the Ottoman garden designers understood sound as completely as they understood visual beauty, was precisely calibrated by the height from which the water fell into the basin and the width of the stream. It was not a thundering or a splashing. It was a gentle, continuous pouring, a sound that occupied the lower frequencies, that registered in the body as much as the ear, that had the quality of something being continuously and unhurriedly begun. Around the central fountain, the paths radiated outward in a pattern that combined the rigour of geometry with the softness of planted edges. The paths themselves were of two types, the wider ones paved with smooth river pebbles set in patterns of light and dark, their surface worn by years of use into a slightly humped, slightly polished surface that caught the light in the mornings and held small pools of standing water after rain, than the narrower ones that were simply beaten earth, bordered on both sides by low hedges of clipped boxwood, whose dense dark green interior gave off, when you brushed against it in passing, smell that was slightly resinous and entirely fresh, and belonged exclusively to boxwood and to nowhere else in the world. The plantings of the garden were seasonal and were tended by a small army of palace gardeners, men, who were among the few categories of non-eunuch males permitted within the outer precincts of the palace grounds, and the succession of blooms across the Ottoman calendar was understood and anticipated, and discussed with an attention and an expertise that would not seem out of place in the most dedicated modern horticultural society. The tulip was of course the supreme flowering plant of the Ottoman world, the flower so beloved by the court that an entire era of Ottoman cultural history, the period of the early 18th century, is known to historians as the Lale Devri, the tulip era, in recognition of the almost religious devotion that the tulip inspired. In the harem gardens, tulips appeared in spring in a range of colours and forms that the gardeners maintained across generations, the particular varieties cultivated and named, and their bulbs stored and prepared with a care equivalent to the care given to any other precious imperial possession. The narrow-petaled Ottoman tulip, quite different from the round cup-shaped varieties familiar today, more like a flame than a cup in its form. Its petals tapering to sharp points at their tips appeared in the garden beds in reds and purples and pale yellows, and the almost white of ivory, and in the right morning light, with the dew still on the petals and the air not yet fully warm, a bed of these tulips in full bloom was an experience that several contemporary observers recorded in terms of visible emotion. After the tulips came the hyacinths, their heavy heads nodding on thick stems, their smell so dense and so sweet that on warm afternoons it filled entire sections of the garden and could be detected as far away as some of the ground-floor corridors of the harem building itself. Then the roses. The garden contained roses of many varieties, including the damask rose whose petals were harvested for the production of attar and rose water, and the roses bloomed from late spring through the summer in such abundance and in such a range of colours, from the deep wine red of the older varieties to the pure white of the alba roses, that the garden in full summer had about it an almost excessive beauty, a beauty that asked something of the observer rather than simply presenting itself. Women of the harem were permitted into the garden on a regular basis, and the garden visit was one of the most anticipated and most treasured elements of the daily and weekly rhythm. For the novices and the less senior women, these visits were supervised, conducted in groups, the movements of the group guided by the conventions of the space rather than by any explicit instruction. For the more senior women, the favourites, the mothers of princes, and above all the Valide Sultan herself, the garden was accessible with a freedom that approached the private. Then there are records that suggest certain women had particular sections of the garden that they regarded as in some informal sense their own, where they had planted particular flowers or installed particular pieces of furniture, and where they could reliably be found on fine afternoons, reading or receiving selected company or simply sitting in the particular quality of stillness that a well-tended garden in good weather can provide. The evenings in the garden were perhaps the most beautiful of all. As the heat of the day released from the stones and the plantings and the garden settled into its evening temperature, which was several degrees cooler than the interior rooms and carried on it the sense of the day's flowers beginning to close, the women who had access to the space sometimes gathered there as the light faded, speaking in the slower register that evenings invite, watching the sky above the palace walls move through its daily spectrum, amber then rose, then the brief deep violet that precedes the arrival of the night's first stars. And the stars above Istanbul were, those centuries before electric light, different magnitude of presence entirely. They hung above the garden walls with an immediacy and a generosity that seems almost unimaginable to us now. The Milky Way was visible on clear nights as a broad, soft brushstroke of concentrated light running from one edge of the visible sky to the other. Individual stars were bright enough to cast faint shadows in moments of full darkness. And the women who looked up at this sky from their garden, standing on their smooth pebbled paths between their beds of tulips and roses, were standing on the same earth under the same stars that you are sleeping beneath tonight. The same sky, the same light, the same hush, just older and quieter and more full of flowers. The morning in the harem began before the light. Or rather, the morning began with the light, with the first grey-blue suggestion of it appearing in the high windows of the dormitory rooms while the sky outside was still closer to night than to dawn, a pre-light that was less a colour than an absence of complete darkness, the first barely perceptible lifting of the night's deepest layer. At this hour the palace was already generating sounds. Not the sounds of people yet, those would come within the hour, but the sounds of the building itself making its morning adjustments, the faint creak of wooden panels expanding in the warming air, the distant clang of a metal pot being placed on a stone surface in the palace kitchens far below, The soft, persistent sound of the fountains in the courtyards that had been running all night and would continue running all day and made the transition from night to morning entirely without pause, indifferent to both. The first human sound was the call to prayer. The Ezan arrived through the high windows of every room in the harem with the quality of something that was simultaneously personal and cosmic, a single human voice, the muezzin of the palace mosque, calling the words that had been called over this city 5 times daily for centuries. His voice trained to carry across distance without losing its essential quality of intimacy, its essential quality of directness, as if the call were being addressed specifically to the individual lying awake in the pre-dawn dimness rather than to the indiscriminate air. Allahu Akbar. The words moved through the rooms and through the bodies of the women who heard them, and for those women who had grown up Muslim, the sound carried with it an entire archive of mourning, every morning of their lives in which this sound had been the first thing to organize consciousness upon waking, the anchor around which a day could orient itself. For those who had come to Islam from other traditions, the morning call was something learned rather than inherited, but learning with time becomes as deep as inheritance, and by the 2nd or 3rd year within the harem's walls, even the most recently converted woman had made the Ezan her own. The practice of wudu, the ritual washing before prayer, was performed at the small wash basins set into niches in the prayer rooms and the dormitory antechambers, and the sound of water running for wudu was among the morning's earliest sounds, series of small individual sounds, the pour of water, the brief friction of hands being washed together, the particular sound of water cupped in the palms and brought to the face, that accumulated across the length of a dormitory corridor into a gentle collective murmur, the sound of a community beginning itself. The prayer itself was performed in the palace mosque for those who had access to it, or in the designated prayer spaces within the harem building for those who did not. The mosque attached to the harem was a small, proportionally intimate space, not the thundering vastness of the great imperial mosques of the city, but a room of human scale, its ceiling low enough that you were aware of being enclosed within it, air held and still and smelling of the sandalwood oil used to polish the wooden minbar and the simple wooden frames of the prayer rugs that were spread in rows across the stone floor. Women prayed in rows behind a carved wooden screen that separated the women's section from the men's, or in the entirely female spaces of the harem, in rooms where there was no screen because there was no separation required. The prayer proceeding with the particular quality that all female sacred spaces sometimes carry, a quality of ease and directness of the body in prayer, not performing for observation but simply being in the prayer for its own sake. After the morning prayer, and after the quiet that followed the prayer in which many women remained seated on their prayer rugs, in a few minutes of reflection or additional supplication, the morning's practical business began. And the first and most fundamental piece of practical business was breakfast. Breakfast in the harem was a communal affair, laid out in the main dining rooms on low tables, around which the women sat on floor cushions or low divans, their legs folded beneath them or extended to one side in the comfortable, graceful posture that the absence of chairs permits. The table was set by the attendants designated for this purpose, young women, generally the most recently arrived of the novices, who carried the trays and arranged the dishes with a careful attentiveness that was itself a form of education, daily lesson in precision and care and the aesthetics of service. The breakfast spread was generous by the standards of most of the world outside the palace walls. There was bread, the round, slightly domed flatbread of the palace bakeries, still warm from the oven, its crust thin and yielding, its interior soft and slightly elastic, with a mild flavour of fermentation from the long overnight rise. There were white cheeses, the firm and slightly salty variety called beyaz peynir, cut into squares and arranged on a ceramic plate alongside cured black olives whose skin had been rubbed with oil, and whose flesh had the yielding, deeply savoury concentration of fruit that has been preserved for months, and has arrived at the far end of that preservation as something richer and more complex than it began. There was honey, thick, amber, slow-moving, served in a small clay pot with a wooden spoon, the honey of a particular region whose bees fed on the flowers of specific plants and whose product carried in consequence a specific floral resonance in its sweetness, detectable if you let the honey sit for a moment on your tongue before swallowing. There was clotted cream in the Turkish-style kaymak, a dense, slightly sweet, extraordinarily luxurious substance that defied the categories of butter and cream by being more unctuous than either, spreadable on bread in thick layers, excellent with honey, responsible for a considerable portion of the happiness generated at harem breakfast tables across the centuries. The morning tea was the Ottoman variety, say served in small tulip-shaped glasses, the liquid inside a deep, clear amber red, hot enough to require holding the glass by its rim rather than its body, slightly bitter on the first sip, and then resolving into warmth and mild sweetness if a small piece of sugar was held between the front teeth in the traditional manner while drinking, the sugar dissolving slowly as the tea passed through it, and arriving at the back of the palate with a gentleness that was one of the minor daily pleasures of living in a world that had, in this one small respect, gotten something exactly right. Conversation at breakfast was generally quiet. The morning held a different quality of speech than the afternoon or evening, less elaborated, more direct, less performative. A question about the day ahead, comment on the weather which was visible in a general sense through the high windows and more precisely through the quality of light in the room. Piece of news, carefully shared, always considered, because in the enclosed world of the harem, information was a kind of currency, and its circulation was governed by the same complex protocols that governed the circulation of all other resources. After breakfast, the day arranged itself, and every day had its own character, own demands, own small gifts. This particular morning, the light through the high windows is growing golden. Outside, within the garden, the first birds of the day have begun. And somewhere in the palace kitchen, someone is already preparing the midday meal. The kitchen of Topkapi Palace was a city within a city. To understand the food that arrived at the tables of the harem, and through that food to understand something essential about the daily lives of the women who ate it, you must first understand the extraordinary scale of the operation that produced it. The palace kitchens, which occupied a substantial portion of the second courtyard of Topkapi, and whose tall chimney stacks were among the most recognizable features of the palace's exterior profile, were organized into 10 separate cooking sections, each responsible for a specific category of production. One for the Sultan's personal table, one for the Valide Sultan, one for the harem generally, one for the pages of the inner palace, one for the officials of the outer palace, and so on, down through the hierarchy of the imperial household, each section calibrated to the status of its recipients and the particular dietary requirements and preferences that status carried with it. At full capacity, the palace kitchens produced food for somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 people daily. This number, encountered in the historical record, requires a moment to absorb. 4,000 people every day. In a world without refrigeration, without industrial processing, without any of the technological supports that modern food production takes for granted, the logistics of this enterprise alone, the purchasing and delivery of raw ingredients, the management of the larders and the spice stores, the scheduling of preparation across the multiple kitchen sections, the coordination of service so that food arrived at the right tables at the right temperature, constituted a form of organizational complexity that rivaled military campaign planning in its demands on those responsible for it. For the women of the harem, food was not merely fuel. This is a statement so obvious it risks appearing trivial, but in the context of the harem's enclosed world, it bears lingering over. In a life that was, by its fundamental structure, one of containment, however luxurious the containment, however much agency some women managed to exercise within it, the pleasures of the table occupied an outsized place in the economy of daily enjoyment. This was understood by the palace administration, and it was reflected in the quality and variety of the food provided. The spice stores of the palace were legendary. Cinnamon and cardamom and black pepper arrived via the trading networks of the empire and beyond, from the spice routes that ran through the Arab lands, and from the ports of the eastern Mediterranean. Saffron, the deep orange threads of the crocus stamens, labor-intensive to harvest and correspondingly precious, more valuable by weight than most metals, was used in the palace kitchens with a generosity that would have been unimaginable in any household below the very highest register of wealth. It went into the rice dishes, imparting a golden colour and a warm, slightly medicinal sweetness. It went into certain sweets. It was dissolved in warm water and used to flavour warm milk drinks served in the evening, and the smell of saffron-infused milk warming over a low flame was one of the distinctively comforting smells of a harem evening. The rice was prepared in many forms. Pilav, the Turkish name for what the word has given to many languages, was the foundation of the principal meal, a dish so central to Ottoman cuisine that its proper preparation was considered a culinary skill of genuine importance, the quality of a cook's pilav serving as a reliable indicator of their overall competence. Perfect pilav required patience above all things. The rice washed until the water ran clear to remove the surface starch, soaked for at least an hour in slightly salted water, cooked with the precise amount of water determined by experience rather than measurement, over a heat that began high and then dropped to its lowest possible setting for the long, slow finishing phase in which the individual grains of rice, having absorbed all the liquid available to them, were allowed to dry slightly in their own steam, separating into distinct, fluffy, taromatic units rather than clumping into the sticky mass that overly moist or overheated rice produced. Palace rice was cooked in the finest Turkish copper pots, their interiors lined with tin to prevent any metallic contamination of the flavours, and the steam that rose from a pot of correctly cooked pilav was sweet and slightly nutty and had about it the warm, comforting quality of bread, fresh from an oven. Beside the rice, the meats. The Ottoman cuisine had an extensive and sophisticated tradition of meat preparation, particularly lamb, whose various cuts were treated with a range of techniques from the slow-braised stew, the surul, vegetables and meat cooked together for hours until the flavours merged into something greater than their sum, to the dry-roasted preparations of the various kebab traditions, the stuffed preparations in which grape leaves or hollowed vegetables became containers for a filling of minced meat and rice and spices and dried fruits that combined sweet and savoury in a balance that seems to me, even at this distance of centuries, like one of the genuine achievements of culinary civilization. The grape leaf dolma, the filling wrapped in a brined leaf, the whole thing simmered in a pot with olive oil and lemon until the leaf had softened and the filling had cooked through and the liquid had reduced to a fragrant, slightly sour, slightly rich sauce, was a dish prepared in palace kitchens with a care and a detail that the women who ate it recognized and appreciated as the care of someone who understood that food was a form of language, a way of saying something true. The sweets of the harem table deserve particular attention because they occupied a special place in the culture. Ottoman confectionery was elaborate, technical, and deeply embedded in the social rituals of the imperial household. Baklava, the layered pastry of paper-thin yufka sheets, clarified butter and sweetened nut filling, soaked after baking in a sugar syrup, scented with rose water or orange blossom, was produced in the palace pastry kitchens in enormous quantities for celebrations and feast days. And its arrival at the harem table was accompanied by a particular quality of anticipation and pleasure that the regularity of its appearance never seemed to diminish. The lokum, the dense, yielding, perfumed confection known in English as Turkish delight, came in varieties flavoured with rose, mastic, pistachio and bergamot, cut into small squares and dusted in fine white sugar that settled in a barely perceptible cloud when disturbed. Eating one required a specific and pleasurable mode of attention, the slight resistance of the outer surface giving way to the dense, almost elastic interior, the flavour releasing slowly and fully over several seconds of chewing. Sherbet, the cold sweetened drinks prepared from fruit concentrates or flower waters or the resinous extract of the mastic tree, arrived at the harem table in the warm months in tall, narrow glasses, beaded with condensation on their outer surface, the drink inside a translucent jewel colour, rose sherbet the colour of pale garnets, tamarind sherbet a warm amber, violet sherbet a colour so delicate it seemed to occupy the borderline between purple and blue, and the act of lifting one of these glasses and drinking from it on a hot summer afternoon was an act of small, complete, entirely sufficient pleasure. The women of the harem ate well. They ate with attention and with appreciation, They developed preferences and aversions, favorites and substitutions. They shared food and discussed food, and occasionally, in the warmth of established friendships, cooked small informal things together in the side kitchens reserved for this purpose. Simple dishes, personal recipes carried from home regions, the particular preparation of a sweet that a woman's grandmother had made and that she had been determined to preserve and pass forward through memory into the new world she now inhabited. Food, the end, was one of the most reliable passages between the self and the world, between the person one had been before these walls and the person one was becoming within them. There were instruments in the harem, not as ornaments, not as props arranged tastefully against a decorative background to suggest the idea of culture. Real instruments played by real women who had studied their craft with the seriousness that the Ottoman palace system demanded of any skill it undertook to cultivate. The harem was, among many other things, a conservatory, an institution that understood music not merely as entertainment but as a discipline, a way of training the mind and the body and the emotional capacity simultaneously, a practice that produced in those who pursued it deeply enough quality of presence and attentiveness that was considered inseparable from the qualities of a refined and complete human being. The primary instrument of the Ottoman harem was the ud, the pear-shaped lute that had been the central instrument of the classical Islamic musical tradition for centuries. Its design evolved from ancient Mesopotamian precedents into something of extraordinary acoustic refinement, to proportions and the thickness of its carved wooden belly calculated to produce a sound of particular warmth and depth. The ud had no frets, which meant that the left hand on the neck was entirely responsible for the placement of the notes, and this in turn meant that the instrument was capable of the microtonal inflections, the small, precise departures from the standard intervals of the scale that were fundamental to the Ottoman makam system, the complex system of modal scales and melodic idioms around which the classical repertoire was organized. Learning the ud properly required years of daily practice beginning in childhood, years of learning the repertoire, years of developing the fine motor calibration that permitted the precise placement of a finger on an unfretted neck to produce the exact quarter tone or three-quarter tone that a particular makam required at a particular point in a particular melody. Women who showed aptitude for music were identified early in their harem education and directed toward formal instruction with the palace musicians who taught the harem's students. These teachers were, in many cases, among the finest musicians in the empire, individuals whose reputations extended well beyond the palace walls, who had spent their lives in the cultivation of the classical tradition, and whose pedagogical methods combined technical rigor with the particular patience that teaching music requires, the patience of someone who understands that a skill being learned in the body, as music ultimately is, the music passing from the ear through the understanding into the fingertips and the breath and the timing of the body itself, cannot be hurried without being damaged. Alongside the ud, the harem's musical practice included the qanun, the flat trapezoidal zither laid across the knees and played with two small plectra worn on the index fingers, its 72 or more strings producing a bright, precise, cascading sound quite different from the ud's warm resonance. There was the ney, the end-blown reed flute of the Sufi tradition, an instrument whose playing technique was so counterintuitive, so demanding of a specific and difficult embouchure, that beginners produced only breath and silence for weeks before the first note appeared, and whose sound, when it finally came, was so particular and so haunting that thin, high, slightly hollow sound, more like a human voice heard through a wall than like any other instrument, that it seemed to arrive from some other register of experience than the ordinary. There was the def, too, the large frame drum held in both hands, its skin struck with the fingers and the heel of the hand in patterns of extraordinary rhythmic complexity, the percussion that underlay all the other instruments, and that kept the ensemble in its time while also carrying the sound of the deaf in a closed room was not the loud, insistent sound of a drum intended to carry over distances. It was more intimate, felt in the chest, felt in the floor under your feet, a sound that involved the entire body of the listener rather than merely the ears. Musical evenings in the harem were among the most socially significant events in the harem's calendar. They might be formal affairs, organized for a specific occasion, a celebration, a festival, a gathering that included women of high rank whose entertainment required a serious musical program. Or they might be more informal, an evening when a woman of recognized musical ability picked up her oudi and began to play because the mood was right and the company was receptive, and others gathered around as the music proceeded, sitting on cushions on the tiled floor, some listening with their eyes closed, some allowing the music to carry them into the particular state of reflective alertness that Ottoman classical music, with its long, slow unfolding of melodic phrases, its preference for gradual development over dramatic gesture, was designed to produce. Dancing was also present in the harem, though it occupied a different register of the social life than music. The dances of the Ottoman harem tradition were not the exaggerated theatrical performances that later Orientalist fantasy would project onto this space. They were more subtle and more interesting than that. The movement vocabulary of the classical Ottoman female dance was based on the torso and the arms rather than the feet, the hips moving in slow, continuous rotations while the arms traced forms in the air of extraordinary grace, the hands and wrists and fingers carrying a significant portion of the dance's expressive weight, the face still and composed above the moving body, the whole effect that of something simultaneously controlled and released, precise and fluid, body speaking in a language that did not need words and did not want them. A woman learning to dance in the harem tradition was learning simultaneously how to inhabit her body with a particular quality of awareness, how to be present in each moment of movement, fully occupied by the physical reality of position and transition and flow. This quality of embodied presence was not considered separate from the other cultivations of the harem education. It was continuous with the attention required for calligraphy, for the precise observation required in embroidery, for the careful listening required in music. All of these practices were, in the deepest sense, the same practice, the practice of being wholly present in the moment and the material at hand. The music in the evenings drifted through the harem the way the rosewater smell drifted, through cracks under doors, around the edges of curtains, down corridors in which it softened and dispersed before arriving, as a very faint and barely distinguishable thread of melody, Protestant in rooms that were at the far edge of the sound's range. A woman lying awake in the dormitory unable to sleep might hear the music from a distant room as something so attenuated by distance that it hovered at the edge of perception, not quite present, not quite imagined, sound that the mind reached toward and in reaching found a quality of concentrated stillness, as if the act of listening for something barely audible was itself a form of meditation. The music played on, the torches burned lower, and the women of the harem, tone by one, grew still. Knowledge was considered, within the Ottoman harem, much a mark of distinction as beauty. Perhaps more, for while beauty was given or withheld by forces entirely outside the individual's control, knowledge was accrued, built up slowly, with discipline and with effort, over years of deliberate practice and study, and the woman who had built a substantial store of it carried with her a kind of authority that neither time nor the shifting preferences of the powerful could easily diminish. A beautiful woman who could not read was subject, in the harem's social calculus, to a permanent ceiling. A woman who could read, who could write with elegance, who had memorized significant portions of the Quran, who could compose a letter in the formal register of Ottoman Turkish, who understood the histories of the empire and the stories of the prophets and the medical knowledge encoded in the classical texts. This woman had equipped herself with tools whose value compounded over time, whose relevance did not depend on the approval of any single powerful individual, and whose presence in her mind and on her tongue gave her a quality of self-possession that the purely beautiful could not match. The educational system within the harem was organized and deliberate. It was not uniform, not every woman received the same instruction, and the depth and scope of education available to any individual depended significantly on her talent, her status, and the interest of those responsible for her development. But the baseline was higher than is sometimes assumed, and the ceiling was, for women of genuine ability and the support of senior figures who recognized that ability, remarkably high. Reading was the foundation. Ottoman Turkish in its written form was a complex and demanding script, the Arabic alphabet adapted for a language with very different phonological structures written right to left, the letters changing form depending on their position in a word, many of the vowels conventionally left unmarked in adult reading texts on the assumption that the experienced reader would supply them from context. Learning to read this script was a serious undertaking that occupied the first several months of a young woman's formal education, and the memory of the difficulty of this learning, the hours of repetition, the gradual emergence of legibility from what had initially appeared to be an entirely opaque visual field, remained with women for decades afterward as one of the defining memories of their education, the memory of a specific and significant cognitive threshold crossed. Once reading was established, the texts began, and the range of texts available within the palace library system, which was extensive and which the harem's more advanced students had access to through carefully supervised borrowing, was by any standard remarkable. The Quran was the first and most important text, its memorization a project that for the most dedicated women could extend over years. The entire text, more than 6,000 verses, organized into 114 surahs of greatly varying length, absorbed not merely as a reading achievement, but as a living internal resource, available at any moment, applicable to any situation. Verses carrying the weight of divine authority combined with the accumulated weight of having been heard and read and spoken in every register of life since earliest childhood. A woman who had memorized the entire Quran, a Hafiza, held a status within the harem community that was entirely independent of her position in the administrative hierarchy. Beyond the Quran, the curriculum included the Hadith, the recorded sayings and practices of the Prophet, and the commentaries and legal texts that had been built upon these foundations over centuries of Islamic scholarship. For women of more secular learning, the historical chronicles of the Ottoman Empire were available, great elaborate narrative histories of the dynasty's origins and conquests, and administrative achievements written in the florid, densely metaphorical prose of the Ottoman chancery tradition, prose style that was itself a kind of art. Its elaboration not a failure of clarity, but a deliberate deployment of language's capacity for ornamentation, the literary equivalent of the tile work and ceiling carving that covered the walls of the rooms in which these texts were read. Mathematics was taught primarily because it was useful. The management of a household of any size required basic accounting, and the management of the complex social and economic arrangements of a senior harem woman's life required considerably more than basic accounting. The Caliphate tradition had contributed enormously to the development of algebra and geometry, and the Ottoman mathematical inheritance was rich. Women who showed aptitude in this area were given access to more advanced texts on calculation and on the astronomical computations that determined the Islamic calendar, an area of practical importance since the dates of Ramadan and the major religious festivals were determined by lunar calculation. And a woman who could perform these calculations independently was a woman who held a specific and valued kind of knowledge. Calligraphy was both a practical skill and a spiritual practice, and it was pursued in the harem with a seriousness that reflected both dimensions simultaneously. The major scripts of the Islamic tradition, Thuluth, Naskh, Talik, and the specifically Ottoman Diwani, required different instruments, different postures, different mental disciplines. The reed pen, the kalem, was cut to a specific width and angle for each script, and the ink, carbon black, suspended in a binding agent that gave it a smooth, consistent flow, was prepared to a specific consistency. The paper was sized to receive the ink without bleeding, and the practice sheet was ruled with a specific instrument. A student learning calligraphy began by tracing existing models for months before attempting any independent work, the hand learning the forms through repetition before the eye could judge their quality, the body absorbing the motor memory of each stroke until it could be reproduced with something approaching automaticity. Poetry, writing and reading was also part of the curriculum for those with inclination and ability. The Ottoman poetic tradition, rooted in the Persian classical forms but thoroughly naturalized into Turkish over centuries of practice, was rich and technically demanding. The classical meter, aruz, was quantitative, based on patterns of long and short syllables that Turkish handles differently from Arabic or Persian, and mastering the composition of a metrically correct ghazal or qasaid was a significant intellectual achievement. Several women of the harem are known to have been poets of genuine accomplishment. Their verses preserved in the great anthologies that Ottoman literary culture produced, and the existence of this tradition suggests that the aspiration to poetic achievement was at least a recognized and perhaps a respected ambition within the walls. In the classrooms of the harem, small rooms, generally on the upper floors where the light was better, furnished with floor cushions and a low reading stand and shelves of books. Girls bent over their calligraphy and their Quranic verses and their mathematical exercises in the particular quality of silence that serious studying produces. Pencases of carved wood or tooled leather lying open beside them. The smell of ink, the sound of a pen being recut. A question asked in a low voice, an answer given. Learning has its own particular peace. It does not age. The clothing of the harem was a language. Not a metaphor for a language, an actual system of communication, as precise and as readable as any written text by those who had been taught to read it, which within the walls of the harem was essentially everyone. The colour of a woman's kaftan, the material from which it was made, the quality and placement of its embroidery, the number and nature of the jewels she wore at her throat and wrists and in her hair, all of these elements were legible to the informed observer as indicators of status of occasion, tough mood in certain circumstances, and of the complex system of patronage and gift-giving that governed the social economy of the harem's upper reaches. The kaftan was the fundamental garment, a long, straight-cut outer robe that fell from the shoulders to the floor, its silhouette simple and its ornament complex, for the simplicity of the cut was precisely calculated to function as a canvas for the decorative work that constituted its real expressive weight. Kaftans of the Ottoman imperial tradition were made from fabrics woven in the imperial looms of Bursa, the great textile city that had been producing silk and velvet of international renown since at least the 14th century. And the quality of these fabrics was extraordinary by any standard then or now. The silks of Bursa came in two primary types relevant to the harem's wardrobe. The kemha was a silk brocade of the highest quality, its ground woven from threads of multiple silk colours, its surface pattern raised by the incorporation of supplementary wefts of metal-wrapped thread, gold-wrapped silk producing the gold brocade that glittered with a warm, heavy richness in lamplight, silver-wrapped producing a cooler gleam. The patterns of kemha fabrics were based on the same vocabulary of arabesques and floral forms and geometric interlacing that governed all the decorative arts of the Ottoman court, but translated into the language of woven textile with specific adaptations, the ogival lattice, for instance, a repeating pattern of interlocking oval or pointed arches, each enclosing a floral spray, translated into woven silk with a rhythmic regularity that was at once static and dynamic. Eye moving from repeat to repeat in a pleasurable pattern-following exercise, while the individual motifs within each repeat offered their own inexhaustible detail to closer examination. The velvet kadife was the other great fabric type, and a velvet kaftan of the imperial standard was among the most materially luxurious objects produced by any craftsperson in the Ottoman world. Cut velvet, in which some areas of the pile were sheared close to the ground while others were left at full height, created patterns of light and shadow, a matte, dark field against which the raised pattern stood in lustrous relief that shifted and changed as the garment moved, the pile catching the light differently at different angles, the pattern appearing to breathe. Senior women of the harem wore velvet kaftans on formal occasions in deep, saturated colours, the particular crimson that the period's dyers achieved from kermes or madder, a red with just enough blue in it to lean toward carmine, the deep blue of indigo at its most concentrated, the green that incorporated both yellow and blue in proportions that varied from one dye lot to another, producing a range from emerald to the cool, slightly grey-green of sage, and a limited use of yellow, which was in some periods associated specifically with the Sultan himself and reserved accordingly. Beneath the kaftan, the inner garments, the intari, a lighter robe of thinner silk, and the shalvar, the loose gathered trousers that were standard female dress, were also carefully made but less elaborately decorated, functioning as the layer against the body, while the kaftan provided the presentation surface. The shalvar of the Ottoman Harem was cut from silk or cotton depending on the season and the occasion, gathered at the waist with a drawstring and at the ankle or calf with a tighter gathering, their generous volume of fabric giving them a fluid quality of movement that was considered aesthetically pleasing, the fabric moving with the body in a slight delay, continuing the gesture of a step or a turn for a half-second after the body itself had settled, effect that gave feminine movement in this dress a quality of gentle consequence, of significance gently amplified. The embroidery, shelame, practiced in the harem was both a profession and a personal accomplishment, and the two functions coexisted without tension. Professional embroiderers were employed in the palace workshops and produced the large-scale embroidered textiles, the cushion covers, the prayer rugs, the ceremonial cloths that furnished the harem's rooms and appeared in the gift exchanges that moved constantly through the palace social economy. But embroidery was also practiced by the women themselves as a personal discipline and creative outlet, and the quality of embroidery that a woman produced was regarded as an indicator of her general caliber, her patience, her precision, her eye for form and color, her capacity for sustained concentrated effort over long periods. The needle used was very fine, and the thread, generally silk, sometimes incorporating gold or silver passing thread, was selected from a palette of colors maintained in the embroidery supply rooms where silk threads hung in organized skeins from wooden dowels, their colors running from the palest ivory through the full spectrum to the deepest, most saturated shades, arranged in gradients that were themselves beautiful to look at, a kind of preliminary composition before any needle had been threaded. The ground fabric, generally a fine linen or a cotton or occasionally a silk, was stretched over an embroidery frame that kept it taut during the work, preventing the puckering and distortion that working unsupported fabric produces. The stitches of Ottoman embroidery were many and varied. The satin stitch, in which long parallel threads lay smooth and close against the surface, their collective sheen producing an area of colour as dense and as luminous as paint. The couching stitch, in which heavier decorative threads were laid on the surface and secured by small, almost invisible perpendicular stitches used for the raised lines of stems and borders. The needle weaving, in which the embroiderer worked threads through existing threads in patterns of extraordinary geometric delicacy. Completed embroidery of the finest harem work was an object that rewarded prolonged examination. At a distance of a metre or two, it presented its dominant composition, the overall pattern, the colour relationships, the balance of filled and unfilled areas. At close range, the individual stitches became legible. The specific decisions made in each square millimetre of work, the adjustment of angle or density that maintained the form through its smaller units, and at the very closest range, a few centimetres, the distance at which you might examine an object you held in your hands in bright light. The materiality of the work revealed itself entirely. The slight sheen differential between neighbouring stitches, the places where two colours met and the boundary between them was negotiated with extraordinary subtlety, barely perceptible dimensionality of certain areas where the layered thread had built up into a very slight relief that you would notice not with your eyes but with a fingertip drawn lightly across the surface. The women who made these objects were making something that would outlast them, something that would survive the end of their names, the end of their recorded stories, the end of everything except the object itself. And many of them survive still. Museum collections in Istanbul and Vienna and Washington, carrying in their stitches the patient touch of hands that are now 5 centuries gone. Every community develops, time, own architecture of belonging, its own system of who stands where in relation to whom, of what marks distinguish one position from another, of how movement through those positions is achieved and acknowledged. In the wider world, such hierarchies are usually at least partially encoded in law, in economic structure, in the accumulated weight of tradition. Within the enclosed world of the harem, the hierarchy was, if anything, more precisely articulated and more scrupulously observed than in the world outside, precisely because the community was so dense, because the relationships within it were so constant and so proximate, and because the stakes of position which determined access to space, to food quality, to clothing, to education, to the Sultan's attention, and ultimately to the kind of life one would live, were so consequential. At the apex of the harem's social structure sat the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning Sultan. Her position will be discussed more fully in the next part, because it deserves the full space of its own consideration. Below her, and arranged in a hierarchy of considerable nuance and occasional fluidity, were the various categories of women whose titles encoded their relationship to the Sultan and to each other. The Kadın Efendi, the Lady Mother, was a woman who had borne the Sultan a child, and particularly a son who had survived infancy. In the Ottoman system, which did not practice formal marriage between the Sultan and the mothers of his children after the empire's early period, bearing a living son elevated a woman from her status as a favoured concubine into something more formally significant, a woman with a specific relationship to a potential future ruler, and therefore with a specific political weight that even the Sultan himself was obliged to take seriously. The Kadın Efendi had her own apartments, her own suite of attendants, her own defined income drawn from the imperial treasury, and her own formal title that placed her clearly within the palace hierarchy. In periods when multiple sons survived to adulthood, the mothers of those sons occupied positions of relative seniority determined by the order of the births, and informally by the relative favour in which their sons were held. Below the Kadın Efendi were the Iqbal, the fortunate ones, women who had come to the Sultan's bed and who were maintained in a state of recognised favour, provided with their own rooms, their own clothing allowance, their own attendants, but who had not yet produced children or whose children had not survived. Their position was more precarious than that of the mothers of princes, dependent on the continuation of the Sultan's interest, which was not guaranteed, but also more dynamic, in the sense that their circumstances could improve rapidly and significantly with the birth of a child. The Gözde, those who have caught the eye, occupied the next level down, women who had attracted the Sultan's attention but whose formal elevation had not yet occurred. This category was probably the most psychologically complex position in the hierarchy, combining the possibility of significant change with the uncertainty that possibility entails, the waiting that is not quite hope, and not quite anxiety, but something between the two, sustained across days and weeks and sometimes months of daily routine. At the foundational level, providing the essential social and domestic fabric of the entire institution, were the carriera in their various stages and specializations, the women who served, who attended, who performed the 10,000 daily tasks that kept an institution of this scale functioning. Their work was the work of the household in the broadest sense, the preparation of food, the maintenance of clothing, the cleaning of rooms, the management of children, the care of senior women, 1,000 small practical tasks that the operation of a complex human community generates daily and that must be performed by someone. The movement through these levels was not entirely predetermined or impossible. It was governed by a combination of the Sultan's personal choices, which were by definition unpredictable and personal, and the internal political dynamics of the harem itself, which were managed primarily by the Valide Sultan and the Hazindar Usta, the chief treasurer of the harem, whose administrative authority over the household's finances gave her a practical power that in some periods rivaled and in certain specific matters exceeded the symbolic power of the Sultan's favourites. The friendships that formed within these hierarchies were complex and layered. There were genuine friendships, bonds of affection formed in the dormitory years, maintained through the diverging trajectories that different women's lives took within the institution, surviving the awkwardnesses of relative position with the particular resilience that early shared experience produces. Two women who had lain awake talking in the same long dormitory room when they were 13 would carry that intimacy with them through all the changes of status and circumstance that the decades brought. They would negotiate the changed protocols that their changed positions required, the forms of address, the appropriate degrees of deference, and underneath those protocols the intimacy would remain, like a warm current beneath a formal surface, detectable to those who knew to look. There were also inevitably rivalries. The enclosed world, the constancy of proximity, the stakes of position, all of these generated tensions that were sometimes managed with extraordinary diplomatic skill and sometimes erupted in ways that the documentary record preserves as evidence of the harem's fundamentally human character. The rivalries between the mothers of competing princes were historically among the most consequential political dynamics of the Ottoman state, the so-called harem politics, that influenced the course of succession and therefore the direction of the entire empire. These were not petty squabbles. They were the political contestations of highly intelligent women operating in the only political arena available to them, deploying the tools of alliance and information and persuasion with a sophistication that the historical record, when it bothers to look clearly, reveals as genuinely impressive. And between rivalry and friendship, filling the greater part of the social space was the ordinary fabric of daily relation, the collegial, the familiar, the comfortable. The women who had lived and worked together for years and who had developed in those years the particular knowledge of each other that close quarters and shared routines produce, the knowledge of moods, of preferences, of the specific sensitivities that each individual carried, who was kind when she was rested but short when she was tired, who could be trusted with a confidence and who could not, who needed reassurance and who resented it, who laughed easily and whose laughter, once begun, was so contagious that it moved through a room like a wave. This social knowledge was itself a kind of wealth, one of the most durable and portable kinds there is. She was the most powerful woman in the world. This is not hyperbole. At the height of Ottoman imperial power, during the period that historians of the empire have come to call the Sultanate of Women, the remarkable era stretching roughly from the 1530s to the 1650s, when the mothers and wives and consorts of the sultans exercised an extraordinary degree of direct political influence, the Valide Sultan occupied a position of formal and informal authority that had no precise parallel in any contemporary European court, and very few parallels anywhere else in the world's history of female power. The title itself, Valide Sultan, meaning Queen Mother, told the essential story. She was the mother of the Sultan, and the Ottoman system, for reasons rooted partly in Islamic respect for the mother and partly in the specific political dynamics of the palace's development over generations, had evolved into a structure in which this relationship conferred not merely honor but authority, real, exercisable, consequential authority over the management of the imperial household and, through that management, over significant portions of the imperial government itself. Her apartments within the harem were the finest in the complex. The suite assigned to the Valide Sultan occupied a position in the harem's architectural geography that corresponded to her position in its social geography, centrally located, extensively connected to the other key spaces of the institution through its own system of corridors and private passages, sufficiently large to contain not merely sleeping and reception rooms but also the full apparatus of a minor court, waiting rooms for those seeking audience, chambers for her personal secretaries and financial administrators, a private bath, prayer rooms, and a series of smaller rooms for the women who attended her personally, and whose physical proximity to her person was itself a mark of their elevated status within the broader hierarchy. The physical space of the Valide Sultan's apartments was decorated with the very finest materials available to the palace workshops. The Iznik tile panels in her main reception room, the salon where she received the senior women of the harem, and, on appropriate occasions, the representatives of the outer court who were permitted access to her, were among the best preserved and most exquisite examples of Ottoman ceramic art in existence. Their ground is the intensely white, almost luminescent white of the finest Iznik production. Their designs are compositions of the utmost grace and balance, large floral forms, the elongated tulip, the carnation, the rose, the hyacinth, arranged against the white ground in compositions that breathed with the particular ease of work produced by artists at the absolute height of their craft and their confidence. The Valide Sultan's day began in the formal acknowledgement of her position. She rose to the morning prayer as everyone in the harem did. But her morning prayer was attended by her personal ladies, women of high rank in their own right, who gathered in her private prayer room and whose presence transformed the intimate ritual of individual prayer into something approaching a small ceremony. After prayer, she received her morning reports, delivered by her chief attendant, the Hazendidar Usta, who had been awake since before the household and who carried in her capacious and rigorously organized memory the state of every significant dynamic currently operating within the institution, who was unwell and required the palace physician, who had requested an audience, what had arrived from the outer court by way of messages or gifts, what the day's special requirements were in terms of food, ceremony, or personnel. Her authority over the outer world was exercised primarily through letters. The Valide Sultan maintained correspondence that extended throughout the empire and beyond it, with provincial governors who sought her intercession with the Sultan, with foreign queens and noble women who understood that her goodwill was a valuable diplomatic asset, with religious scholars and foundation administrators who were connected to the charitable institutions she managed, and with the imperial bureaucracy in its various forms. Several Valide sultans were prolific letter writers of genuine intelligence and facility, and their surviving correspondence reveals minds of considerable analytical sharpness operating within the particular rhetorical conventions of Ottoman chancery communication, a formal, elaborate style that was itself a craft, and that they had mastered completely. The charitable foundations, the Vakif, that the Valide sultans established were perhaps their most enduring contributions to the world beyond the harem walls. Ottoman tradition permitted the establishment of charitable endowments in perpetuity, funded from designated revenues, and the most prominent women of the imperial household used this institution to leave permanent marks on the landscape of the empire. Mosques and their attached complexes, hospitals, schools, public fountains, caravanserais, soup kitchens. The Valide Sultan Mosque in the Üsküdar neighborhood of Istanbul, built for Kozum Sultan, one of the most powerful of the Valide sultans, was an entire charitable complex, its revenue-generating properties including shops and market buildings and a hammam, the income from which sustained the mosque's operations, paid the salaries of its staff, fed the poor of the neighborhood 3 times daily, and provided for the education of the students in its attached school. She built this and more, and it still stands. Kozum Sultan herself, born in the late 16th century, possibly of Greek or Bosnian origin, entering the harem as a young woman and rising to be the mother of 2 sultans and the grandmother of a 3rd, was perhaps the most politically effective of all the Valide sultans, managing the affairs of state with a combination of intelligence and practicality that the historical record documents in detail. She corresponded with the Venetian ambassador, negotiated with the Janissary Corps, managed successions and administered charity on a scale that made her among the most significant architectural patrons in the history of Istanbul. Her end, when it came in 1651, at the hands of a palace faction aligned against her, was the end of a life of extraordinary consequence, a life that had moved through the harem's gates as a young woman with nothing but potential and had become, through decades of cultivation and effort, and the particular intelligence she brought to every challenge she encountered, one of the most consequential figures in the history of an empire. She had walked these marble floors. She had looked through these latticed windows at the lights of Istanbul reflected in the Bosphorus at night. She had heard the izan from these rooms every morning for more than half a century. Her slippered footsteps are recorded in the stone. The depression at the threshold of the Valide Sultan's reception room, worn by 60 years of daily use, her autobiography. There is a particular feeling that comes over you when you have spent a long time with the past. Not the reading of it exactly, though reading is where it begins. not the studying of dates and genealogies and the chains of political cause and effect, though these too have their place. The feeling I am describing comes at a different moment, a later one, the moment when the accumulated weight of all that you have read and studied and imagined begins to coalesce into something that functions more like memory than like knowledge, the moment when the distant ceases to feel distant and the unfamiliar ceases to feel strange, and you find yourself, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, genuinely surprised that you cannot simply walk down a particular corridor and find there the woman you have been reading about, engaged in the particular activity you have been imagining for her. This feeling is not confusion. It is, I think, one of the most honest responses that history can produce in a careful and attentive reader. It is the recognition that the past was not a different country, not a lesser or more primitive or more exotic version of the present, but simply another present, a present that happened to have been inhabited by people whose specific circumstances and tools and expectations were different from ours, but who moved through their days with the same basic emotional reality, the same need for warmth and beauty and companionship and purpose that we bring to our own mornings. The women of the Ottoman Harem inhabited time differently than we do, but they inhabited time. Let us sit with that for a moment. They had mornings in which they woke to a sky that seemed particularly beautiful and were grateful wordlessly or in prayer for the light. They had evenings when they were tired in the specific way that a long day makes you tired, not dramatically, not philosophically, just ordinarily tired, the body asking to be horizontal, the mind releasing its grip on the day's concerns with something between relief and reluctance. They had moments of laughter so genuine and so sudden that they startled themselves with it, the laugh arriving before the decision to laugh, the body responding to joy before the mind had confirmed that joy was appropriate. They had moments of loneliness of the most specific and private kind, not the grand romantic loneliness of literary heroes, but the small particular loneliness of being in a room full of people and feeling, despite that fullness, entirely alone. They worried, they planned, they hoped, they remembered. They remembered in particular things that were gone, the landscapes of their childhoods, the faces of their mothers, the specific quality of light on a particular morning that had, for reasons they could not always explain, refused to leave their inner vision over years and decades of subsequent experience. Memory, as every person who has ever been separated from their first world understands, does not diminish evenly with time. Certain things, a smell, a sound, the precise temperature of a particular season, remain with total fidelity, while whole years of closer experience grow vague and interchangeable. A woman who had been brought to Istanbul from the Caucasus at the age of 14 might, at the age of 50, be unable to recall the exact layout of the streets of the city she had grown up in, but might still carry within her, perfectly preserved, the smell of the pine forests on the hills above her village in late autumn, when the air was cold enough to make the resin smell sharper and more present than it was in warm weather. These remembered worlds lived inside the women of the harem alongside the world of the palace itself, cohabiting quietly the way that all of our interior worlds are populated by the accumulated residue of every place we have ever been and every person we have ever loved, pressing gently against the present tense from the inside, giving depth and resonance to what would otherwise be only the flat surface of the now. Time within the harem's walls had a particular texture. The enclosure that was the harem's most defining spatial characteristic, the high walls, the inner courts, the world constructed to be self-sufficient and self-referential, created a temporal quality as well. When the outside world is largely inaccessible, its ordinary markers of passing time, the opening of a new shop across the street, the changing face of a neighbor's child, the seasonal transformation of a landscape that includes a horizon are absent, and the time left is primarily the time of the body and the time of the institution. The body marks time with its own cycles, hunger and satiation, waking and sleep, the monthly rhythm, the progression from the flexibility of youth toward the different kind of strength that middle age brings. The institution marks time with its ceremonies and its seasons, its religious calendar, its cycles of succession. Several of the women who spent their lives within the harem, those whose letters or memoirs have survived or whose accounts were recorded by others, described the experience of time within its walls as both slower and more full than they imagined external time to be. Slower, because the days had a regularity and a predictability that removed the temporal acceleration that novelty and change produce. More full, because the reduction in the quantity of experience was compensated by an increase in the intensity with which available experience was perceived. When the garden is the extent of the outside world available to you, you notice the garden very completely. You know it in every season, in every light, in the various states of its plantings and its weather. You develop a relationship with specific trees and specific corners that you would never develop with a garden you could leave at will, because the ability to leave diminishes the imperative to enter fully. This intensified perception of the available world was perhaps one of the unintended gifts of the harem's enclosure. A world made deliberately small becomes, through the attention it invites and requires, a world of inexhaustible detail, and a life lived in close attention to the available detail. The quality of the light, the smell of the season, the expression in a friend's face, the specific pleasure of a particular food on a particular afternoon, is not a diminished life. It is, in many ways, the life that our overexpanded, sensation-saturated modern existence most consistently fails to provide, a life that is actually experienced rather than merely passed through. The women of the harem had time in the one sense that matters most. They had the kind of time that notices things, and in noticing them, made them last. Legacy is a strange and unpredictable thing. It does not distribute itself according to the logic of power or achievement or intention. It follows its own routes, settles in its own places, survives through its own peculiar resilience. The greatest warrior of an age may leave less in the world than a woman who planted a garden that outlasted her by 4 centuries. The most celebrated poet of a generation may leave a more modest trace than the anonymous craftsperson whose tiled panel still stops museum visitors dead in their tracks on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in a city far from where either of them was born. The women of the Ottoman Harem left their legacy in several forms, and it is worth taking the time in this part of our evening together to sit with each of them, to turn them over gently in the mind, the way you might turn over a smooth stone in your hand, feeling its particular weight and temperature, noticing the details of its surface that you would miss if you simply glanced at it and moved on. The most visible form of their legacy is architectural and charitable. The mosques, the fountains, the schools, the hospitals that the most powerful among them constructed across the breadth of the Ottoman Empire. Istanbul alone contains dozens of structures whose origins lie in the patronage of harem women. The Atik Valide Mosque complex in Üsküdar, commissioned by Valide Sultan in the 16th century. The Yeni Camii, the new mosque by the Golden Horn, whose construction was begun by Safiye Sultan and completed by Turhan Sultan. The Çinili Camii, the tiled mosque, another Üsküdar jewel that bears the distinctive mark of its patron's taste in its extraordinary interior tile work. These are not peripheral or marginal structures. They are among the central monuments of Istanbul's skyline, visited by millions of people annually, photographed and admired and studied, and the names of their patrons are known to those who look, inscribed in the founding dedications carved in the stone of their doorways or preserved in the Ottoman historical record. The charitable networks that these women created were not static monuments but living institutions, endowments that funded ongoing activity in the world for generations after their founders' deaths. A soup kitchen founded by a Valide Sultan in the 16th century might continue to feed the poor of its neighborhood well into the 18th century. Its operations sustained by revenues from the markets and bathhouses and rental properties that had been designated as the endowment's income sources. This meant that the women who founded these institutions were effectively present in the world, exercising a material benevolence, feeding people and educating people and healing people long after their deaths. Their agency did not end at the grave. It was institutionalized in structures that carried it forward. Below the level of the grand architectural patrons, the legacy of the harem women exists in forms less monumental but no less real. It exists in the objects that have survived, the embroideries and the garments and the jewels that are now held in the collections of the Topkapi Palace Museum and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and 100 smaller collections around the world. Every one of these objects was made by someone, handled by someone, worn by someone, given and received and kept and loved. The kaftan in the museum case, its velvet deep red still vibrant after 5 centuries, its gold brocade still catching the light at its original angle, was once warm, was once inhabited, was once taken off at the end of an evening and folded carefully by the attendant who hung it in the press with the cedar wood that kept the moths away. The legacy also exists, more diffusely but no less truly, in the city itself. Istanbul was shaped by the harem in ways that are structural and that have persisted long after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. In the layout of the old city's neighborhoods, in the location of its charitable institutions, the cultural traditions and culinary practices and musical forms that were cultivated within the palace, and that radiated outward from it into the broader urban culture. The traditions of Ottoman classical music that are maintained and practiced in Istanbul today, by musicians who have studied with teachers who trace their lineage back to the palace schools, carry within them the influence of the women who played and who listened and who, through their patronage and their discernment, shaped what the tradition valued and what it preserved. And there is another kind of legacy that is the hardest to see and perhaps the most important, the legacy of example, the example of women who, within constraints that would have defeated many, found ways to exercise intelligence and agency and taste, who built things, who learned things, who taught what they had learned to the women who came after them, who maintained, within walls that were not of their choosing, an inner life of complexity and richness that the walls could not reach. The novice who arrived as a frightened child and became, over decades, a woman of considerable wisdom. What did she leave? No building carries her name, no document records her specific history. But the woman who came to the harem after her, and who was taught by her and who was treated by her with the particular kindness that only someone who remembers their own frightened arrival can offer, that woman carried something forward and passed it on in turn. This is the most durable form of legacy and the least acknowledged one, the transmission, person to person and generation to generation, of the knowledge of how to be human with some grace and some courage and some attentiveness to the available beauty. No wall was ever built high enough to prevent that transmission. No distance was ever great enough to stop it. It arrives here, tonight, without diminishment, and settles around you like a quilt. There is a category of beauty that belongs specifically to things that have been forgotten. Not lost. Lost implies that something was actively misplaced, that its absence constitutes a failure of some kind, a gap in a record that should have been kept more carefully. Forgotten is something different and, in its own way, more interesting. Thing that has been forgotten was once known, was once present in someone's daily experience, was once so completely a part of the ordinary fabric of life that the person living with it could not have imagined needing to remember it, because you do not remember what is simply there. What is as present and as unremarkable as the air in the room. You remember things after you lose them. You remember things in their absence. The daily life of the women of the Ottoman Harem was full of things that were once entirely present and are now entirely forgotten, not by anyone in particular, not through anyone's negligence, but through the natural process by which the specific details of ordinary life disappear from the record, while the larger structures and the notable events are preserved. We know in rough outline the political history of the harem's most powerful women. We know the architectural legacy, we know the broad contours of the hierarchical system. But we do not know, cannot know, because the record does not preserve it, what the woman in the 3rd dormitory bed from the left window was called, or what she thought about in the half-hour between waking and prayer, what specific series of memories came to her on the night of the first winter rain, when the smell of wet stone drifting through the high windows bore some resemblance to a smell she had known in another place and another life. These are the forgotten things, and they are, in a sense, infinite. Every human life generates them. Every day of every life contains 10,000 details that are felt and processed and then released, drifting out of active memory into that vast, formless reservoir of the experienced but not retained, from which only certain very specific stimuli can occasionally retrieve a fragment, a smell, particular quality of light, a texture under the fingers. The women of the harem had their own vast reservoirs of the experienced but not retained, their own disappeared dailiness, and the fact of its disappearance does not diminish it. It simply locates it in the category of things that were real for precisely as long as they needed to be real, which is the category in which, if we are honest, most of the real things of any life ultimately belong. There is a kind of peace available in this recognition, the peace of understanding that the beauty of a moment does not depend on its being preserved, that the value of an experience is not contingent on its being remembered, that a woman who spent a fine afternoon in a garden full of tulips in the year 1590 received from that afternoon exactly what the afternoon had to offer: the light, the smell, the colour, the quality of warmth on her shoulders, and that neither the subsequent centuries of forgetting nor the impossibility of our ever knowing her name diminishes by a single gram what she received in those hours. The harem was full of this kind of beauty. It was full of the beauty of routine, the beauty that accumulates in repeated acts performed with care over long periods of time, the beauty of the same prayer said in the same room at the same hour over decades, the beauty of a friendship maintained with the small, regular attentions that friendship requires, a piece of fruit brought from the garden visit, a word of encouragement offered at the moment when encouragement was specifically needed, the willingness to sit in companionable silence when conversation was not what the other person needed. It was full of the beauty of skill, the particular beauty that develops in a craft practiced daily for years when the practitioner's relationship to the work has moved past effort and self-consciousness into something more fluid and more generous, something that gives rather than strains, something that leaves in the completed work not the marks of labour but the marks of ease. The calligrapher who had been writing for 30 years and whose hand moved over the page with the particular quality of unhurried confidence that is among the most beautiful things a hand can do. The embroiderer whose needle moved through the ground fabric with a rhythm so established that she could sustain it while talking or listening. The hands working in a semi-independent register while her attention lived elsewhere, and then returned to find the work had advanced without her self-conscious supervision. It was full of the beauty of water, the constant presence of water in sound and sight and touch, the fountain in the garden, the water in the hammam basin, the small stone wash basin in the prayer antechamber, the rain on the high windows in autumn, the condensation on a glass of sherbet in summer. Water that moved and spoke and reflected and cooled, that was in the fabric of every hour of every day, so present as to become invisible, so constant as to become silence. And it was full of the beauty of the night, the deep, dense, multi-layered darkness of a night before electric light, in a city whose illumination was limited to the warm individual pools of oil lamps and candles that could not collectively compete with the darkness, but could only negotiate with it, carving out small human territories of warm light within the prevailing dark. The night in the harem was not a hostile or a frightening thing. It was the natural state of the world after the sun had moved on to illuminate somewhere else, and the women who lay in their beds as the lamps were extinguished and the darkness settled were not lying in danger, but in the oldest and most reliable comfort available to embodied beings, the comfort of the end of the day, the comfort of the body released from its vertical obligations, the comfort of the mind given permission to dissolve. These beautiful forgotten things have not vanished. They have simply changed their form. They exist now not as facts but as atmosphere, as the particular feeling that comes over you in a quiet room with warm walls and the distant sound of water, when the light is amber and the day is done and your body is growing heavy with the very specific and very necessary weight of approaching rest. That feeling is not new. It is very, very old. You're feeling it now. Breathe in. The Topkapi Palace closes its gates to visitors at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The tourists move out through the imperial gate in the last thin light of the day, their footsteps on the paving stones of the second courtyard, a percussion that fades gradually as they disperse into the city beyond the walls. The museum staff complete their last rounds. The lights in the case rooms are extinguished one by one. The gates are locked, the guards take their positions, and then the palace is alone. This aloneness is not emptiness. Let us be careful about that. The palace in its post-visiting hours quiet is not empty any more than a library is empty when it is closed. It is simply closed to the particular form of activity that constitutes its public function, while all its deeper and more private functions continue without interruption. The stone walls are still holding within them the warmth of a day's sun. The cypress trees in the gardens are still moving in the evening wind from the Bosphorus, their dark, narrow forms describing arcs of motion against the sky. In the distance, visible from any high point within the palace grounds, the lights of Istanbul are beginning to come on, the bridges, the shore road, the minarets of the great mosques, and their reflections are appearing in the water of the strait below, doubled and softened, the hard geometry of electric light transformed by water into something more fluid and more forgiving. In the rooms of the harem, now museum rooms, each behind its rope barrier, its temperature controlled, its light carefully limited to the level that will not damage the centuries-old pigments in the tile panels, the silence is of a particular quality that all preserved spaces eventually develop. Quality that is simultaneously the silence of the museum and the silence of the stopped life. The stopped life is there still. The ropes and the controlled temperatures and the explanatory cards in Turkish and English do not change the fundamental character of these rooms, which is the character of rooms that have been inhabited, that were shaped by and around the habits of specific bodies living specific days, and that carry in their surfaces and their proportions and their materiality the impression of those days as reliably as stone carries the impression of a fossil. The rooms speak in the night when no one is there to listen. Not literally, this is not a ghost story, and the palace has no interest in drama. They speak in the way that all old things speak, by persisting, by continuing to be what they were made to be, long after the purpose for which they were made has changed beyond recognition. The tile panel in the Valide Sultan's salon continues to be a tile panel of extraordinary beauty produced by craftspeople whose names we do not know, in a tradition that has since contracted almost to extinction for a woman whose power once extended over an empire. All of these facts coexist in the object simultaneously, layered within it the way the geological strata are layered in a cliff face. Each one a record of a different period and a different set of conditions, all of them visible to the patient observer. What remains of the women of the harem is everything that was real about them and nothing that was merely circumstantial. The power structures that shaped their lives have long since dissolved. The hierarchy that determined who slept in which room and who wore what colour and who had access to the Sultan's attention, all of this is now history flat and past and without consequence for anyone currently alive. The political struggles that consumed so much energy and produced so much anxiety within those walls resolved themselves centuries ago into outcomes that we know and that they could not know, and the anxiety that went into those struggles is impossible to recover, it is simply gone. But what remains is the feeling, the particular quality of presence that a human life, lived fully in whatever circumstances are available to it, imparts to the physical spaces it moves through, the worn marble at the threshold, the light column on the tiled floor in the morning, falling at exactly the angle it has always fallen because the window that casts it is in the same position it has always been in, and the sun moves through the same arc it has always moved through, indifferent to the centuries. The smell, on certain warm evenings when the air is coming from the right direction, of the rose garden that still exists within the palace grounds, a smell so ancient and so present simultaneously that it seems to contain within it every morning on which a woman in these rooms breathed it in and paused, registered it and went on with her day. The palace holds these women still, not as ghosts, not as presences in any supernatural sense, but as the accumulated impression of 10,000 days of ordinary life, pressed gently into the stone and the wood and the tile of the rooms that received them. An impression not of tragedy or of drama, but of the specific quality of a human life being lived, imperfectly, partially, in the full uncertainty of a present that does not know it will become history, simply being what it is. This is what endures. Not the power, not the politics. Not the hierarchy or the constraints. The simply being there endures. The morning light on the tiled floor. The fountain in the courtyard, unhurried. The sound of an oud being played in a room down the corridor. The notes drifting through the still air of the palace after dark, thanging in the space between walls for a few moments longer than physics strictly requires, the way that all music does as if reluctant to become silenced. The palace is breathing tonight. The stone breathes slowly, the way mountains breathe, tin rhythms too long and too patient for us to measure. But it breathes. And somewhere in that breath, embedded in it, inseparable from it, are all the women who ever breathed here before us. All of them. Still, the evening is deepening now, and the walls of the palace are growing darker. The amber light of the oil lamps has entered its last, lowest phase. The wicks burn down to the point where the flame is small and very still, and the light it produces has contracted from a generous pool into a gentle suggestion, a warmth rather than an illumination, a presence felt more than seen. In the corridors the shadows have filled in completely. The marble floor no longer visible in the stretches between the lamp niches, the architecture retreated into a darkness that is soft and close and entirely without threat. The darkness of a house at night, the darkness of a room known so well that the absence of light does not constitute disorientation. You know where the walls are, you know where the doorways are. The spatial knowledge carried in the body's memory requires no illumination to remain accurate. The women of the harem are preparing for sleep. This is happening, has happened, is always happening in some sense. The particular moment of the day when the body finally gives itself permission to be entirely what it is, which is heavy and warm and more ready to be horizontal than vertical, and deeply glad of the prospect of the quilt pulled up to the chin and the pillow received under the cheek, and the long, slow dissolution of the day's accumulated weight into the mattress beneath and the darkness above. In the dormitory rooms, the bedtime rituals are underway, moving quietly and without hurry through their familiar sequence. Hair unbraided from its daytime arrangements, combed out with the tortoiseshell comb, rebraided loosely in a nighttime plait that will come undone while sleeping and be found in the morning as a gentle tangle, the kind of tangle that combs through easily, still fragrant from the oil applied last evening. Faces washed at the small basin with water that has been standing in the room and has taken on the room's temperature, which is just warm enough to be pleasant on the skin of the face at night. The day's kaftan removed and folded, the nighttime garment, loose, soft, white cotton, worn without ornamentation, drawn over the head and adjusted around the body. The beds received their occupants one by one. The mattresses were filled with cotton batting in winter, which compressed gently under the body's weight and distributed warmth with a consistency that the modern person who sleeps on a cotton mattress in a cold room would recognize immediately. The pillows were generous. The Ottoman cushion-making tradition valued the kind of pillow that yielded completely to the weight of the head, reforming itself around the skull without resistance, holding it in a pocket of soft material from which it could drift in any direction with no sensation of effort. The quilts were silk on the exterior layer a smooth, plain silk in the colours appropriate to the season and the room's palette, and filled with carded wool or fine cotton. And their weight when settled onto the body was the particular weight of a good quilt that is neither too heavy nor too light, just sufficient to produce the sensation of gentle containment, of being covered in the best sense, of having a boundary established between the body and the surrounding air that the body experienced as safety. The lamps in the dormitory were extinguished. One by one, beginning at the far end of the room and moving toward the door, the small bronze lamps were pinched out by the last attendant making her evening rounds, and with each extinguishing the darkness in the room, deepened by one increment, the shadows from the remaining lamps growing longer and softer until the final lamp went out and the room entered its nightly state of complete and gentle dark. Through the high windows, those same high windows that admitted the morning's first pale light, the night sky of Istanbul was faintly visible, not the sky itself, which was behind the angle of the window, but a luminous residue of it, the diffused ambient glow of a city of several 100,000 people, and their collective illumination. This was not bright, it was not sufficient to read by, not sufficient to discern individual objects in the room, but it was enough to indicate the window's position, to provide the sleeping mind with a minimal spatial anchor, a barely perceptible knowledge of direction and the world beyond. The sounds of the palace at night were few and widely spaced. The guards making their rounds on the outer walls, their footsteps audible at regular intervals, growing and fading with a predictable rhythm that had become, after years of nightly repetition, so familiar as to be not merely untroubling but actively reassuring, regular external confirmation that the world was proceeding as expected. The fountains in the courtyard, continuous and unchanging, the same patient sound at midnight as at noon, the sound that had been running beneath the day's other sounds and that emerged now in the quiet as the primary sound of the night, the most persistent, the most constant, the one that would still be running when everything else had stilled, the distant call of a night bird somewhere in the garden, its single note repeated at long intervals with a patience that matched the patience of the fountain. And underneath all of these sounds, or perhaps behind them, or more accurately permeating them, the way warmth permeates a well-built room, the sound that was not quite a sound, the sound of the building breathing, of the wood settling in its joints as the night temperature dropped, the faint pops and releases of a structure in its ongoing negotiation with gravity and time, and the thermal contraction of the small hours. The women sleeping in this building were sleeping inside all of this. The fountain, the guard's footsteps, the bird, the building's settling breath, all of it enfolding them with the gentle impersonality of the world continuing to be itself, the reassurance that the world does not require their wakefulness, that everything necessary will continue whether or not they are conscious to attend to it, that the night's business is none of their business, and that the best possible contribution they can make to the next morning is to allow this night to carry them all the way into it, surrendered, unhurried, already beginning to dream. The body grows slower. The breathing deepens. The mind releases its last small grip on the day, the final unconsidered worry, the last half-formed thought, the sentence that had been forming itself and is now dissolving before completion, and what remains is simply the warmth and the dark and the sound of water that has been running since before you arrived and will still be running when you are gone. You are very nearly asleep now. The palace is very quiet. The fountain is the only voice. And it says only one thing, always and without variation. Here, now. Still. Let us go even more slowly now. There is no hurry, there has never been any hurry in this place, in these final minutes of the evening when the lamps are out and the corridors are empty, and the only movement in all the vast, sleeping complex of the Topkapi Palace is the water in the fountain and the stars moving their immeasurably slow arc across the sky above the garden. Let your body settle a little deeper. Feel the surface beneath you accepting your weight completely, not as a resistance but as a meeting, the way two surfaces meet when they have been shaped to fit each other, each one perfectly accommodating the particular weight and warmth and contour of the other. Your shoulders are resting, your hands are resting, your face is resting, there is nothing in your face right now that is doing anything. No effort of expression, no residual tension in the muscles around the eyes or the jaw or the forehead. Everything has let go. Everything is simply present, simply resting, simply being whatever the body is when it is doing nothing at all, which is to say exactly what it is, nothing more and nothing less. Somewhere in the Ottoman Harem, the year 1603, young woman is lying in this same position. She has been in Istanbul for approximately 2 years. She came from a small town in the mountains of the Western Caucasus, a town you have never heard of, whose name she cannot pronounce in Ottoman Turkish and has given up trying to pronounce. She was 15 when she arrived. She is 17 now. She has learned to read and to write in a new language. She has learned to pray in a new way. She has made 3 friends, real friends, not merely the polite affinities of enforced proximity, but real ones, with the texture and the warmth that real friendship has. She has embroidered a cushion cover that a senior woman admired and said so, and the memory of that admiration is still warm in her chest when she thinks about it. Tonight she is lying in her bed in the dormitory on the upper floor of the harem's eastern wing. The room is dark. The fountain in the courtyard below her window is running with its familiar, continuous, entirely indifferent patience. She is drifting. She is thinking of something, but only barely. The thought is losing its edges. It had something to do with tomorrow, something that needed to happen tomorrow, some small practical matter she had intended to remember, but the intention and the matter are both softening now, the thought dissolving at its edges like a shape held in fog, and she is not quite sure whether she is still thinking it or whether it has already become something closer to a feeling, a general, formless awareness that there is a tomorrow, and that it will contain the thing she cannot quite remember, and that this is fine, and that she will remember it when it arrives, and that right now the only thing that is real is the darkness and the warmth and the sound of the water. Her breathing has slowed. And here is the extraordinary thing, the thing that is, you sit with it long enough, genuinely extraordinary. At this moment, this breath, this particular quality of almost a sleep that she is inhabiting in the year 1603, she is indistinguishable from you. Not in her circumstances, not in her history, not in the language of her inner voice or the content of the thought she is releasing, but in the quality of this moment, in the sensation of warmth and dark and weight, and the slow deepening dissolution of consciousness. She is exactly you, and you are exactly her. The 5 centuries between you have no existence at this level of experience, at this level which is the level just below thought, just below language, just below the particular and the historical and the named. At this level there is only a warm body in a dark room, breathing slowly, growing more quiet with each breath, approaching the same state of complete and innocent surrender that every human being who has ever lived has approached at the end of every day. 5 centuries. 1,000 years, 10,000 years. Every person who has ever fallen asleep has arrived at this same threshold, has felt the thought losing its edges, has felt the body growing heavy with its own warmth, has heard, imagined, remembered some quiet sound in the distance, water, or wind, the almost inaudible rhythm of someone else breathing nearby, and has crossed over. The young woman in the eastern wing of the harem is crossing over now. She will dream of something she does not expect to dream of. This is how dreams work, arriving with their own agenda, bearing gifts and confusions that make sense only in the logic of the body's night processing, the mind sorting and filing and occasionally producing, from the material of the day's experience and the archive of all previous days. Something unexpected and luminous and strange. She will wake to the Izan before sunrise, and she will rise, and she will perform her wudu, and she will pray, and the thought she could not remember will come back to her while her hands are moving through the washing ritual, and she will think, yes, and the day will begin again with that particular quality of beginning, the particular freshness of a self that has been completely absent for several hours, and has returned as it always does to find the world still here, the water still running, the marble still cool, the light just beginning. But that is morning. This is the deep, dark, good part of the night. This is the part that belongs to no one in particular and to everyone completely. This is the part in which the palace and the city and the water and the stars and every sleeping body in every room in every city on this sleeping, breathing, slowly turning earth are all doing the same single thing. The fountain runs. The water does not hurry. The stars move at their own pace, which is no pace at all from where we lie. The walls are warm. The quilts are warm. Your breath is slow. The young woman in 1603 is asleep. The old woman who will be in this same room in 1643, who will be that same young woman grown into something quieter and stronger and more full, she is also in this moment somehow asleep, her future rest as real as her past waking, the two coexisting in the timeless architecture of the building that held them both. The fountain runs. You are warm. You are breathing slowly. There is nowhere to be. There is nothing to remember. There is only the dark and the water and the stars above the garden and the long, patient, completely generous night of Istanbul spreading outward from these walls in every direction, over the rooftops and the minarets and the dark water of the Bosphorus and the hills of Asia rising beyond it, and all the sleeping world beyond those hills, and you are held in the centre of it, warm and still exactly as heavy as you are, exactly as quiet as you need to be. Sleep now. The fountain will keep the time. The walls will keep the warmth. And morning, when it comes, will find you rested, just as it has always found the world rested, just as it always will. Sleep. Welcome to Sleepy History with Henry. Here, we harness AI to breathe new life into authentic historical records, creating an immersive auditory experience. This entire production is AI-assisted, crafted solely for relaxation and sleep support. TAND is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Please do not listen while driving or operating machinery. Now, let Henry and AI guide you on a peaceful journey through the past.